Hello everyone, I'm Eileen and I will be your online tutor for ECON1002, Introductory Macroeconomics. So to put it simply, macroeconomics is just a branch of economics that studies the behavior and performance of an economy as a whole. So we'll start off this course by talking about how economists measure macroeconomic performance. One of the successful indicators of performance is high output. This is measured through a concept known as gross domestic product, which is what we'll go into detail about today. So this video will mostly focus on GDP and the various methods of calculating GDP. We'll also briefly talk about the circular flow of income. Furthermore, we'll discuss about nominal and real GDP as well as how to calculate real GDP. And finally, our last topic will be a bit of theory about real GDP and economic well-being. So the formal definition for GDP is the market value of the final goods and services produced in a country during a given period of time. It is a measure of a country's output. So the keywords in here are market value and final goods and services. So market value means the current price at which the good or service is sold in the market. One thing to remember is that this excludes unpaid work. So, for example, volunteering is not counted as a component of GDP. Another thing to know is that public goods and services which are provided by the government do not have a market price and are therefore counted at their cost of provision. So final goods and services means the final good or service which is ultimately consumed by the consumer. So an example of a final good and service would include bread. So there are three ways of measuring GDP. The first way is the expenditure method. The way to calculate GDP using the expenditure method is to sum up total consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports in the economy. The second way to measure GDP is using the value-added method. So this measures the total production in the economy. GDP is calculated by valuing each stage of production towards a final product. And the final method of calculating GDP is using the income method. So income method measures the total income in the economy. So it's a sum of labor income, which is also known as wages, capital income, which is also known as rent, and interest income and firm's profit. From these three methods, we can see that GDP can be seen in three ways. It can be seen as total expenditure in the economy, it can be seen as total production in the economy, and finally, it can be seen as total income in the economy. So the first method that we'll look at is the expenditure method. So the expenditure method is the total sum of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So consumption represents all the household consumption on durables and non-durables in the economy. The investment component of GDP can be split into three parts. So the first part is business fixed investment. Now, business fixed investment represents the purchase of new capital goods by firms. So, for example, if a firm buys new machinery and factories, this will be counted as business fixed investment. Investment can be also seen as residential investment. So that involves the construction of new homes and apartments. And the last component of investment is inventory investment. So this represents all the goods a firm produces but does not end up selling during the current period. So the way to calculate inventory investment is closing inventory minus beginning inventory. The G component of GDP is known as government spending. So this includes government purchases of all final goods. One really important thing to remember is that government spending excludes transfer payments, because transfer payments are indirectly included in the consumption component of GDP. So we do not add transfer payments into government spending when we're calculating GDP. So that's really important. And the last component of GDP is net exports. So this represents all the exports in the economy minus the imports in the economy. Okay, so now this is our first example on calculating GDP using the expenditure method. So here's a typical question that you might get in an exam. So the question says, calculate GDP for country A using the expenditure method given that household consumption is 200, government expenditure is 400, fixed capital expenditure is 50, change in inventories is 100, exports are 70, and imports are 100. Okay, so remember that the formula for GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, which is X minus M. So what's consumption in this economy? Well, that's in the question. It says household consumption is 200. Now, investment in the economy So that includes capital expenditure, which is 50, and change in inventories, which is 100, plus government spending. So government expenditure in the question, we can see that it's at 400, plus X minus M, which is net exports. So exports in the economy is 70, and imports is 100. So when we add those components all together, we should get 720. So that's a very simple example on how to calculate GDP using the expenditure method. Okay, so here is our next example. So this is another question where we have to use the expenditure method to calculate GDP. This example is slightly harder. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is go down our list and see which of these are components of GDP. So the first one, consumption expenditure, well, that's part of the C component of GDP. Imports is also part of GDP. So let's tick these, the ones that are part of GDP. Construction of new homes is part of business investment, so we can tick that. Exports is also part of GDP. Government purchases of goods and services, well, that's just the G component of GDP, so we can tick that. Business fixed investment, also part of GDP. And closing inventory stock and opening inventory stock makes up change of inventories, so we can tick those as well because that's also part of the GDP. Now, household purchases of durable goods and services, well, that's already indirectly included in our consumption expenditure, so we don't need that one. Sales of existing homes, that's not part of GDP. And government transfer payments is also indirectly included in consumption expenditure, so we don't need that. Now remember that calculating GDP, we use a formula, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. So consumption here is 700. Now investment includes business fixed investment, which is 200, plus construction of new homes, which represents our residential investment, plus our change in inventory. So that's closing inventory minus opening inventory. So that would be 150 minus 50, which is just 100. So that makes up all of our investment. Then we have to add government expenditure, so that's easy, that's just 200. And then we have to add on our net exports, so that would be exports minus imports, which is 100 minus 50. So if you add all those up, you should get 1350. So therefore, GDP equals 1350.